Hello, you've tuned into State of Southasia, a podcast from Himal Southasian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Nantara Narayanan, coming to you from Bangalore. In December, the International Truth and Justice Project, or ITJP, announced that it had submitted more than 60 sanction and travel ban requests against Sri Lankan officials and security personnel for human rights violations committed during the country's decades-long armed conflict and after it. The ITJP has sent these requests to countries such as the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, and the European Union, and also to the United Nations. These requests are based on the ITJP's extensive documentation of violations that include extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary arrests, torture, and sexual violence. The people who the ITJP has requested sanctions against had various roles to play in these abuses and belonged to the Sri Lankan military forces, paramilitary groups, civil servants including judges and former government ministers, and also former members of the Indian peacekeeping force. Today, I speak to Yasmin Sooka, a human rights lawyer and the executive director of the ITJP. The ITJP has one of the largest repositories of evidence of abuses during the final phase of the war and in the post-war years. Yasmin has produced several reports and has been on the expert panel for the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights investigation into Sri Lanka. She joins me from Johannesburg to talk about the sanction requests, the importance of accountability and reconciliation in Sri Lanka, and her hopes from the country's new political dispensation that there might be some movement towards transitional justice after many, many years and many failed attempts. Yasmin, thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for having me, and I hope your listeners enjoy this particular podcast.
Before we jump into the discussion, I'd like to quickly remind our listeners to visit our website himalmag.com and click on Support Himal to become a paying patron of the magazine. Help us in our mission to show you South Asia like no one else can. Now on to our conversation. Yasmin, the ITJP has been working for justice and reconciliation in the aftermath of the war in Sri Lanka for several years now and has made several requests to foreign states for action against perpetrators of these human rights violations and war crimes. One of these examples is that the ITJP asked Singapore to arrest Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who is the former president and who oversaw the most violent end to the war as defense secretary. He had fled to Singapore in 2022 when that request was made. To begin with, I want to ask you about the timing of these more than 60 sanction requests. Why now?
Actually, I think, it wasn't that the 60 requests were made in December 2024. In fact, what we chose to do was to use the date of the 10th December, which is normally when the British government announces their sanctions, to actually publicize the fact that between the period 2021 and 2024, we had made more than 60 submissions. But in actual fact, our first submission, sanction submission, was made in 2021. And that was really around the role played by the then Army Commander General Shavendra Silva, who was the head of the 58th Division in Sri Lanka and who was in the main war zone at the time when much of these atrocities were carried out.
Right. So to get into specifics, how will these sanctions affect the accused if they are imposed?
Well, what happens is, you have to make a request either under the Magnitsky sanctions regime, and a lot of countries have enacted Magnitsky legislation. And then, of course, in the United States, you also have an additional layer, which is called 7031C designations. And these really relate to visa and travel bans. So in the case of Shavendra, he was designated under 7031C. And what that meant was that neither he or any of his family members would be able to travel to the United States. Also, whatever assets they have there, they would not be able to access, and that would be an asset freeze. And so that's a very effective way. But of course, it relies on your being able to show that, in fact, the information is valid. And so normally you have to put in place a number of sources which can be verified by the department dealing with sanctions. And of course, in his case, we were able to use a number of UN reports as well as corroboration provided by many people who were in the war zone at the time.
Right. Is there any indication, has there been any response from any of the governments you've sent these requests to? Do you think they will take action on these requests?
Well, the first part is obviously being able to make the submissions. And the ITJP has made submissions both to the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada as well, and more recently to the European Union as well. And in the case of Canada, they sanctioned both the Rajapaksa brothers and their families. In the case of the United States, we have quite a number of people who were involved in the Trincomalee incident in Sri Lanka. Naval officers were also sanctioned. And then we also looked at the role played by two members of the judiciary, and there have been a number of people who have also been implicated in corruption and economic crimes. And in those cases, sanctions have happened as well. But what normally happens is that it's quite unusual for the country concerned to actually, announce publicly that they've sanctioned people. And the only time that they actually find out is when they do try to travel. So I would say that there have been fairly successful responses to the sanctions request. Of course, it took the United Kingdom quite a long time, and I think it was only last year that you had sanctions imposed in two instances. But I have to say the UK government has been the more difficult one. And yet you've had quite an extensive lobbying campaign conducted by many MPs from the Labour Party and many activists who are based in London. And it took a long time for the UK government to respond to that.
You mentioned economic crimes, and in its submission, the ITJP has included that the significant structurally embedded corruption in Sri Lanka, the kind of which triggered the economic crisis that we saw a few years ago, it mentions that as one of the reasons for the sanction request. Can you just take us through why that is?
Yeah, in the context of our investigations that we've carried out, and this is certainly true for many other parts of the world where you have conflict, there's usually a question of who the beneficiary of that conflict is. And so there's a real link between what we would call political crimes of the past and economic crimes and corruption. And, while individual sanctions in a way target individuals, one of the questions that is always preoccupied one is how do you deal with what are institutional questions, the structural underpinnings, and that make it possible for these violations to take place. And that is where we've also suggested that, in fact, a country that wants to unpack that structural underpinnings, so it doesn't just look at the question of what individual violations are about, but really begins to look at how do you look at the future as well. And there, I think the field of transitional justice is quite sort of useful. But in the case of Sri Lanka, I'll give you one example. When you take the case, for instance, of Lasantha Vikramatunga, who was assassinated by members of the security forces, many in the country believe that the reason that he was taken out was because he was carrying out a number of investigations against members of the ruling party. And he'd also accused, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was then defense secretary, of taking kickbacks in arms procurement. And Lasanta was also investigating the procurement of second-hand MiG jet fighters from the Ukraine, without following due process, but also which involved a large amount of kickbacks both to Sri Lankans and, of course, people in the Ukraine. And he was really very critical of the role that was being played by Mahinda. And so we have certainly found that when you look at, economic crimes in Sri Lanka, they usually have been linked also to many of the people who were responsible for the brutal war in Sri Lanka and the way in which it ended. Because, when you look at the conflict, particularly in the period between January and May 2009, the RTTE was really a spent force by then, and the people who were being targeted were really Tamil civilians who were forced to flee into particularly what were called, safety zones. And the moment they entered those zones, that is when they were bombed and shelled. And they finally end up on a very small strip of land. And, the government denied how many people were actually in the war zone. And based on the false numbers they were putting out, they didn't send in enough medical, resources, and neither did they send in enough food and water. And effectively, they deprived the civilian population of all of the instruments that are necessary to guarantee their survival. And so when you look at the linkage between that, I think you begin to see a picture emerge of how you got to this economic crisis in 2021. And what is really striking about Sri Lanka is that the IMF, I think, did a report on governance. It was an assessment, really, of what was wrong with governance institutions in Sri Lanka and why it was that the economic crimes and corruption was able to continue. And I would argue that it's really the first time that you've seen the IMF take that kind of deep gaze at what is happening in a particular country and make recommendations which enable the country to actually go forward. And a lot of that had to do with the role played by the political elites in the country and the way in which governance and many, instruments of governance had been usurped by politicians for their own use, including in the economic corruption in the country.
Right. Himal just published a piece on the murder of Lasantha Vikramatunga and the investigation into the case, the many delays and obfuscations in that case. So I'd like to remind our listeners to go and read that if you haven't read it already. Yasmin, the war ended in 2009, but in 2014, you published a report that showed that there were several abuses in the post-war period. And these were targeted at LTTE suspects or their supporters and aimed at extracting confessions or information. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, we've always argued, and in that report in 2014, we interviewed a group of survivors who had fled from Sri Lanka. And when we began to unpack their testimonies, and we were very fortunate in that instance because this was done in conjunction with the Bar Human Rights Council in the United Kingdom. And we were very lucky to get a number of barristers who then interviewed each of the individuals who were part of that study. And so you had quite an independent verification of the testimonies of these people. And I think what was quite shocking to us was that even though the conflict had ended formally with the official declaration of victory in May 2009, actually many of the abductions that we were investigating continued well beyond that period. And in fact, in the course of those abductions, people were tortured very badly. And usually they were accused of being members of the LTTE. And often they were also accused of wanting to restart the LTTE again. What was also striking, and I mean, I have dealt with many conflicts and violations around the world. But what was particularly striking for me was the sexual violence. And in fact, if you look at our documentation, I think we've probably been one of those groups that have managed to document male sexual violence and Sri Lanka has one of the highest levels. We also found that, in fact, for the main part, most of our victim survivors indicated that they were members of the security forces who picked them up. And in fact, they also extorted bribes from their family members to have them released from their custody. And in many instances, people were told you must leave the country immediately or you're going to find yourself back in detention. And this, of course, is so, one of the things we also said is when you look at the situation in Sri Lanka and you look at the figures really for people who are in detention formally, I think that the figure around what I would call the black detentions are even higher. And for a long time, I think, government and many people were in denial about the fact that this was still ongoing. And in fact, through our documentation, we were able to show that even as late as last year, there were people who were being picked up. The difference being that now you were seeing young people being picked up. And often this is because they were participating in demonstrations for knowledge about and where of the whereabouts of the disappeared. And they would, then accused of trying to revive the RTTE. But we have cases that extend to as late, I think, as October last year. Now, we haven't done much individual cases since then, because we have been, I guess, trying to look at doing a proper analysis of all the information that we have on file. And if you go to our website, you will see that we've published a number of reports. And, we published one on the current president, the former president, Ranil Wickremesinghe. This was when he was in charge of labor. And there was an official commission of inquiry that was set up by the government at the time into what they call the Batalanda violence. And he's named in that report that nothing actually happened to him. And in fact, this is a problem with Sri Lanka. There have been more than 36 commissions of inquiry that have been set up by different regimes. But when you actually look at how many of those reports were made public, hardly half of them, and also none of the recommendations have ever been implemented. And these government commissions were actually quite useful because they actually named perpetrators, but nothing actually happened to them. And I think that's a problem of the impunity that does prevail in Sri Lanka.
Right. Yasmin, can we talk a little bit more about why that despite the findings of these internal commissions, the commissions constituted within Sri Lanka, despite their quite damning findings, that action is never taken? Is it because these are kind of top-down structures and so it's difficult to implement anything or take any action?
I think that what you've seen in Sri Lanka has been, I would say, probably more than 3 decades of impunity. And that has become quite entrenched in the political system. In fact, one of the reports that we published dealt with the violence which took place between 1987 and 1989 and involved really members of the JVP political party structures and, of course, innocent civilians. And even then, despite what was happening in the country, you didn't see any action. In the context of the end of the war, you also had the Lessons Learned Commission, you had, I think, the Udagama report, you had a range of reports. But, I think what was quite striking about one of the last reports was that it dealt with the fact that there were such damning allegations around the political assassination of the political wing of the LTTE, which surrendered under a white flag in terms of a negotiated process, that in fact the judge said that it was very clear this needed to be investigated properly and the allegations actually dealt with, and nothing ever happened around that. You also had, I think, when you had a change of regime in the 2015 period, you had the government of Maitri Sirisena. Sri Lanka engaged in the Human Rights Council process and agreed to a joint resolution. And that resolution committed Sri Lanka to a very comprehensive transitional justice process, which would involve setting up a special hybrid court to really deal with the allegations around serious international crimes, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a reparations office, and I think there was an office on reconciliation as well, and an office of missing persons. The ink was hardly dry on the resolution when, on the return back home to Sri Lanka, the government just said, we are not going to abide by some aspects of the resolution. We certainly don't intend to set up any of these hybrid courts. And, we will begin to deal with it in our own way. And what was interesting was that the international community provided an enormous amount of technical support to Sri Lanka to actually develop legislation around setting up a truth commission at the time. And at the end of the period of Sirisena's, regime, nothing had actually been set up. And in fact, today, all you have is an Office of Reparations, which has just paid out people, who were affected by, I think, the protests that took place in the 2021 period. But actually, in terms of reparations to survivors of the conflict, you haven't seen much of that happen. Then you do have an Office of Missing rather than disappeared. And that's been interesting too, that the terminology that was used to set up that office was around missing persons rather than looking at the question of enforced disappearances. And that was deliberate because, in fact, if you look at the campaign of the mothers of the disappeared, many of them handed over loved ones into the custody of the military, and they've never been seen today. And Sri Lanka has, in fact, the second highest number of missing and disappeared in the world. And yet, despite the visits of the committee that deals with, the working group actually, that deals with the missing and disappeared, you haven't seen much results emerging from the government of Sri Lanka. And I think that has been a challenge. And so when you look at this question of accountability, it's not surprising that you've hardly seen anybody ever being held accountable.
Right. In 2020, the researcher Bhavani Fonseca wrote a piece for Himal about 3 cases that demonstrated the many impediments to accountability in Sri Lanka: immunity for a former rebel turned politician, the delays in justice in the case of a former senior Navy official, and the presidential pardon for a convicted murderer. You can find that story and many more on the subject on our website, himalmag.com. Himal brings you important perspective of conflict wherever it happens in South Asia. It takes a lot to do this work, and we rely on listeners like you. You can support the magazine by becoming a paying patron. Click on the link in the episode notes or go to our website and click Support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters to keep up with our latest events, stories, and more. Now back to our conversation with Yasmin Sooka. Talking about international action and pressure to bring about accountability, in these cases specific to Sri Lanka, are targeted actions like sanctions against individuals, like the ones the ITJP has requested, are they better measures than broader measures like lobbying for removal of trade concessions, which has been tried in the past?
So sanctions are always a very difficult issue because when you look at the question of broader sanctions, I think one of the issues you always have to look at is what will its effect be on the ordinary population? Targeted sanctions where you're targeting individuals, like, you know that you're dealing with an individual who has a case to answer. In my country, for instance, sanctions was a very important part of the call during the apartheid era. And we asked the international community to boycott the apartheid government. there were many people who also argued that, in fact, what that was doing was hurting ordinary people. But in the country at the time, we said that we were willing to support that because we thought that the broader objective was good. And I think we're in this kind of crisis in the current period in the world with the advent of the new regime in the United States. You're seeing how these really broad-sided initiatives are going to have quite an impact on the political economy of many countries and the ability to deal really with the questions of healthcare. Look at the way in which any program that is dealing with diversity, dealing with the question of the rights of women, the rights of members of the LGBTIQA community, and it's going to hurt them. The other question, of course, is this imposition of a 25% tariff that Trump is using in a very punitive way. And I think that this is forcing many of us to go back to the drawing board and look at the effect of what this means for a general population. And so while I think at the time in 2021, it was a huge campaign, I think, in Sri Lanka and abroad to kind of really look at the abrogation of the concessions. Many people also argued with the World Bank that if you were going to make these loans to Sri Lanka, that they should be done on a conditional basis. And people actually set out what those conditions should be. And I think that kind of initiative is very useful because when governments then have to comply with conditions which can, in fact, be monitored and assessed on an independent basis by civil society, then that's quite useful to do. But I think that, now we're entering, I would say, a new kind of trade conflict, and many countries who are in the global south are really going to feel the effects of that. And so going forward, what they're all going to have to look at is how they come together and really deal with, and I think when you look at the multilateral system, it's really under attack by the current government in the United States. I think that these are going to be very complex issues that we're going to have to navigate going forward. And the only way we're going to be able to deal with it is if we understand properly how that works and how it's going to affect the population as a whole. Because if it's just about targeting political elites, I think that that's not an issue, and I would certainly be one that goes for that. But I think that we've got to be a lot more, circumspect in the way in which we go forward now. And that's why, when in that article we published, we also talked about the fact that in any country, the best form of justice is when it's done at a domestic level. And that complies really with international norms, that the obligation of the state is to ensure that where these serious international crimes have been committed, that they take responsibility for ensuring accountability, whether it's in the form of criminal accountability or in the form of truth recovery or reparations or a search for missing persons. And the only time when the international community should step in is if that country is unwilling or if it is unable to do so in terms of lacking the capacity. Now, the one thing I would argue with is that Sri Lanka doesn't lack capacity. In fact, I think it is one of the most interesting, civil society groups that exists in the social justice, human rights, and legal sector. I think there are challenges with the penal code, and there's certainly a number of amendments that need to be made, including the questions of command and superior responsibility, including serious international crimes in their statute books, and ensuring that all of the Geneva Conventions are incorporated. The other issue is, of course, the Office of the Attorney General, which needs to be reformed because there's such a conflict of interest. The Attorney General is dealing with cases for the state, but he's also acting as the lawyer of the state. And in that context, we have always argued, like many people, including the CPA in Sri Lanka, that you actually need an office, an independent office of special prosecutor. So, when you look at this question of what kind of actions you take, it's really in the absence of a domestic process that you begin to look at what else can be done to ensure justice. Now, the more obvious one has been universal jurisdiction. But universal jurisdiction cases are notoriously difficult, and they're also far and few between. And in the case of Sri Lanka, I think one of the first ones that we did was when General Jagasjar Surya, who had been the former army commander, he'd been posted to Latin America as the ambassador to 5 Latin American countries. And so, in fact, we filed a case under universal jurisdiction in the courts in Brazil. And we also did that in the other Latin American countries. But General Jagat Surya was tipped off. And in fact, he then fled Brazil. And while we, in fact, sent a dossier around him to Canada as well, which he was visiting quite regularly, nothing actually happened with that. In the case, of course, of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, when he had just stepped down as Secretary of Defense, and we had the testimony of 11 victims of torture. And in the case of one, the UN Human Rights Committee had in fact made an order that the Sri Lankan government should pay him compensation, and nothing actually happened in his case. And so, on his behalf and 10 other survivors, we filed a case under the Victims Torture Protection Act in the United States against Gotabaya. And what was so interesting, and that's, of course, the kind of arrogance, I think, of many perpetrators. He was walking around freely in Trader Joe's, and we were able to serve papers on him. And I think it was quite a shock for him that this could actually happen. The challenge, of course, then was that before he could file a response to our papers, he won the elections in Sri Lanka. And then he was protected by immunity of office. And so, I mean, while many survivors were very happy to see that the papers had actually been filed, I think they were equally disappointed by the fact that we had to set aside our case because otherwise we would have incurred legal costs. Again, of course, when he fled to Singapore, when he stepped down as president, we were conscious of the fact that he no longer enjoyed the immunity of office. And we also had a substantial case file of evidence against him. And we then filed this criminal complaint in Singapore with the Attorney General. Now, normally, I think Sri Lankans have a long period of latitude to remain in Singapore without having a visa. But I think once the Singaporean government got wind of the case, they kind of told him, listen, you have so many days and you need to leave. And that is when he went back to Sri Lanka, where I think he has been protected to a certain extent by the political elites in the former regime. And that meant that like nothing actually kind of happened to him. We've also, been admitted as a party in a universal jurisdiction case in France. And we're always looking at what kind of opportunities there are to actually use the material that we have. And we've also made that available to different UN investigations. We do have, a case in the United Kingdom where 2 suspects who've been linked to war crimes from a Sri Lankan paramilitary group, in fact, aligned to the military, were referred to the Metropolitan Police, and they did arrest them. And recently, the Metropolitan Police did put out a call for information. But universal jurisdiction cases, you can actually count their number across the world. There also, I think, often it's a question of foreign political interests, and you have to be aware of that. It's not purely a human rights issue, which is what we would think would be the case. But you've also had a number of courts who've been quite successful. So when you look at Germany, for instance, they've dealt with some notorious Syrian torturers, and those cases have been interesting. But as I say, in the absence of that, you also then look at sanctions, designations, but they can be quite tricky.
Right. Just to clarify for our listeners that universal jurisdiction cases are those that allow national courts in other countries to try people on the grounds that their actions violate international law and harm the international community and international order. Yasmin, you said that there were encouraging signs, some encouraging signs from this new government. And of course, this new political dispensation in Sri Lanka in last year's elections completely broke with the Rajapaksas and that the former political elite. President Anura Kumara Dissanayake, or AKD as he's called, has promised yet another Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But how likely is it that this government, which is very different from previous ones, will address justice and accountability?
One is always hopeful. And I think that what you have seen, quite hopeful signs. But, statements have to be matched with actions. And in fact, before you can set up a truth commission in Sri Lanka or any justice mechanism, there are a number of reforms that have to take place. The last government did publish draft legislation, which was then, I think, passed by Parliament. But of course, it wasn't nothing was implemented from them. And I think we pointed out that there were a number of flaws in the draft legislation, including the fact that victims could, in fact, seek justice. Whatever was said in the Truth Commission would not be available to the prosecutorial services. And I think that those kind of issues then create quite a blurring, because it also meant that you would not be able to hold the military in particular to account. And I think that's the biggest problem in Sri Lanka, that a truth commission would need to be accompanied with a range of other complementary mechanisms. You would need, I think, an independent court. And people in Sri Lanka don't trust the domestic system to deal with these kinds of political crimes. So you'd have to find a way of making sure that it enjoys some kind of hybrid character, which should involve bringing perhaps judges from the rest of South Asia to sit with Sri Lankan judges in this kind of court. You'd need to enact changes in legislation as well. And then when you look at the question of a truth commission, we were struck by the fact that the way in which the previous government dealt with consultations, which have become quite a norm when you set up a transitional justice mechanism, is there was hardly any consultation with victims' groups. And in fact, the kind of people they selected to participate in discussions was not really comprehensive or inclusive. And that would need to be the starting point. That, we always say that there are three ingredients that are necessary for a successful transitional justice mechanism. The one is the political will on the part of the government. The second is the question of, national ownership. And the third is the question of participation. And, a striking example is, of course, the last time when the government did commit to setting up a truth commission, you had a very comprehensive consultation process that took place in Sri Lanka, which was set up quite formally. And I think the head of the CPA was part of it at that point. And they made really a number of recommendations on how to strengthen any process, including truth recovery and reparations. And so I would argue that if this government wants to actually set up such a commission, they need to really be wise to go and have a look at the recommendations that came from that project, which the government completely ignored, by the way. And that would be a very useful starting point. for a real discussion in Sri Lanka to talk about a credible and legitimate process.
I just want to shift focus from Sri Lanka for a moment. The ITJP is also working on Bangladesh, the need for accountability for the killings that took place during the monsoon protests last year. Where do things stand in terms of your investigation in those cases and setting up other processes for Bangladesh?
We were in Bangladesh, and what we did was, of course, that DS Tech Group scraped whatever cell phone footage there was on social media. And in fact, our investigators tracked down the people who took the cell phone footage. And what we were then able to get was a confirmation that we were able to use that. So the question of informed consent. The second is using digital forensic tools. We were able to use the metadata to show that, in fact, the images were not altered in any way. And in fact, we were able to put in place, using chronolocation and geolocation, exactly where these incidents took place and where the shootings were taking place as well. And what we focused on was really, what happened in Bangladesh at the Jatrabari police station, where there were unarmed protesters who were protesting. And then, of course, you had this police killings, really, of unarmed civilians. And we put that together in a film, which we then launched formally in Bangladesh when we were there recently. We also looked at another case, the targeted killing of a young man called Hridroy Ali. And what we were able to show with the way in which we put this together, and we were very fortunate. And we also had access to a weapons and military expert, and they were able to give us a sense of the direction that, the shooting was in fact coming from. And so, what we wanted to show with these films is that it's possible to use this kind of footage in court proceedings, but that to do so, you need to be very clear about what the demands of any trial will be regarding this kind of digital evidence, because we're in a new world in which technology plays a big role. And so we showed this publicly, but we also did a private screening. The government of Bangladesh reconstituted the International Criminal Tribunal that was very criticized, I think, in the period when they were dealing with the war crimes of the previous regime. And we were able to show them that, you can't just show a video or cell phone footage. What you need to do is you need to take it through all of the evidentiary steps to make sure that this can be handled properly and received as proper evidence by any court. And so there is already a process in Bangladesh. The challenge, of course, and I think we had many discussions with politicians, with the head of the prosecution, with the three judges who chair the tribunal, is this question of the death penalty. There is no intention in Bangladesh of a moratorium on the death penalty at this point. And neither, I think, are you going to find that the interim government is going to do anything around it. I don't think they believe that they enjoy the political support to be able to set that aside. And so that does pose a problem for Bangladesh. And I think it's going to link directly to this question of their calls for extradition, particularly the extradition of Sheikh Hasina from India. No country is going to extradite somebody at such a high level, because you will have concerns about due process, fair trial procedures, and of course the imposition of the death penalty. And so that is why I think we've been quite careful to say that, if you look at prosecutions in every country, often you're dealing with foot soldiers, but you never really get to the top, the people who have what we call command or superior responsibility. And in those kind of cases, you really need to look at the question of linkage evidence. And that means looking at command structures. You need to look at which units were in a particular area at a particular time, because you need to link that to the actual incident. And so I think that what the head of the prosecution was saying is that, like more of that capacity building needed to be done, as well as, of course, more access to digital expertise, because there's an incredible amount of footage on social media, but making sure, social media is also something that can be both disinformation and information. And so you need to take it through a very careful process before you can actually use it. So I think that that is where Bangladesh needs support. You also have the interim head of government did set up the missing persons body, but they also lack resources and support. And, that is also a process that is going to need, I think, a lot of capacity building to make sure that it can deliver justice to the families of victims.
If I can ask you a bigger picture question now, we've seen how global funding cuts since Donald Trump has become president of the United States again affect many areas of humanitarian work. We've seen the sanctions that he's imposed on the ICC. What do you think that the legal processes, the truth and reconciliation processes around the world, are they going to be affected? And what does the ITJP's own future look like?
I think that the funding cut and the punitive way in which it's been exercised, I think is certainly affecting, the global outlook, and it's certainly going to affect an INGO like ourselves as well. And one of the things we're also very concerned about is that, when you get funding, whether you get funding from the State Department in the United States or from a funder who is based in the United States, there's this compliance form that you have to sign that you don't use their money for lobbying. Otherwise, that US funder can't actually remit or transmit those funds to you. And we are concerned that, in fact, the next step, besides cutting federal grants, which I think are affecting governments across the world, and besides looking at funders like the DRL, the Democracy and Human Rights Fund, or in fact the Endowment for Democracy or the USAID Fund, I think you're going to see that this is going to affect civil society groups across the world. What we've also picked up in the last 3 weeks is that our traditional funders are also under siege, because you can imagine the crisis that has been occasioned. And so traditional funding sources are also saying that they have been inundated with requests to make up the gaps. And I think that that's going to affect not just us, but many other groups. And one particular group, we run a survivor-led psychosocial project in the United Kingdom, which deals mainly with survivors of the conflict in Sri Lanka. And that's where we got a huge amount of US funding, and we've had to move that service online because we just don't have the resources now to bring everybody together. We used to meet once a week. People would be supported not only by counselors who did both joint, and individual sessions, but we also provided English lessons and art classes, and therapy of different kinds, so that people could also you'd also have a community. And that's, not going to be possible right now. So we are looking at what kind of strategies we can use. But I think the one issue is the way in which global justice, which we have fought for so many years, is being upended by the actions of this particular regime. I think the second issue is that when you look at questions, the first instruction was remove the words diversity and equality and equity. And it almost seems to be an initiative which is prioritizing white supremacy. And so anybody with a darker skin or who belongs to a different race, I think is going to be the subject of a lot of punitive actions coming from the United States. And I fear for what is, the withdrawal of the United States from the Human Rights Council. When they have been there, they've been able to play quite a positive role. But without that particular voice of, diplomats who've been quite seasoned, I think you're also going to see the polarity in the Human Rights Council increase. And I think that, what we are creating is a world in which you're either with us or you're against us. And it's almost like a new Cold War. And I think it's going to permeate a whole range of avenues. I mean, my own country, we have this crisis. Now we are being threatened with sanctions because we have passed bills which have long been coming in dealing with transformation and transformative justice in our country. And you see these, very powerful white South African men who are white supremacists actually influencing policy in the United States, which is a real problem.
Right. My final question, can you give us three recommendations? These can be books or movies or podcasts that help explain either the Sri Lankan conflict or mechanisms of truth and reconciliation or the importance of transitional justice, something for our listeners to just get into the subject more and understand what it's all about. So, what would you recommend?
So, I looked again what was out there, and one of the most, I think, remarkable documentaries that have been made is The Killing Fields by Callum McRae. And that really gives you a picture of what happened in the period between 2008, when the UN and the international community were ordered to leave, and the war zone, and from that period right up until the end of the war. And that's really a remarkable, I would say, historical contextual picture of what happened in Sri Lanka. A second movie is one that was made by a colleague, Mutra Hulia, Easy to Full Stop by Shireen Xavier. And it tells the story through the lens of individuals impacted by the war. I found that one, also very useful. And then in terms of a book, my colleague Francis Harrison, who was also a BBC journalist in Sri Lanka at some point, did a book called Counting the Dead. And it's, the testimonies taken of many different people who survived the conflict and their own personal experiences. And that's been a very powerful picture. On the Truth Commission, I mean, there are a number of books, but like I thought that what would really be useful for your viewers and listeners is that when the Truth Commission in South Africa was taking place, it was covered live by radio, the public broadcaster, and by television. And in fact, there's a series on a website, and it's done through live hearings that are taking place of human rights violations hearing where victims come forward, and then the amnesty hearings where perpetrators come forward to confess to the crimes that they've been implicated in. And then on a weekly basis, you had a special program which was done by a person called Max Dupree, and it's an analysis of what was happening in the process every week and linking it to these bigger questions of, did it achieve the truth? How did it compare with the lies of the past government? All that kind of analysis. And when I was at the Foundation for Human Rights in South Africa, we supported the South African History Archives and the South African Public Broadcasting Service to put this online so that it could be made available to everybody. And so anybody who wants to learn about how Truth and Reconciliation Commissions work and what some of the pivotal questions are can actually access this. And they will find that absolutely useful.
Yasmin, thank you so much for those recommendations, and thank you so much for joining me in this important and very illuminating conversation. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
That was Yasmin Sooka on the State of South Asia podcast. Go to our website himalmag.com to read much more about Sri Lanka, its war, the aftermath, including a piece on the devastating poetry of Tamil women who fought in the Civil War. You'll find that story and more in the episode notes. And don't forget to tune in to the next edition of the South Asia Review of Books podcast, where Shweta Srikantan will be speaking to Manan Ahmed Asif on his latest book, Disrupted City. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes, and you can share, rate, and review them. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in-depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nayantara Narayanan. Thank you for listening and see you then.